What if anxiety isn't a flaw, but a message? There's a moment many of us know all too well, sitting alone in the quiet of the evening, the house quiet, the outside world settling down, but inside the mind refuses to rest. Thoughts swirl like autumn leaves, old regrets, petty worries, fears about the future. The silence that once felt comfortable now fills with worry. You might even wonder, why do I feel this way? Haven't I gotten over it? But what if the presence of anxiety doesn't mean you're failing? What if it means you're listening? In Buddhist wisdom, suffering is not an enemy. It's a teacher. Anxiety is not evidence that there's something wrong with you. It's not a punishment for getting old, nor is it a weakness of character. It's a signpost, a gentle, albeit uncomfortable invitation to look within, to calm down, to change. You see, we live in a world that teaches us to push away discomfort, to distract, to numb, to silence the inner voice. But Buddhist philosophy offers something entirely different. The idea that anxiety, when responded to with compassion, can lead us back to what's truly important. In this video, we won't fight anxiety. We'll listen to it. You'll discover ancient insights and calming reflections that can help you engage your anxious thoughts with more kindness, clarity, and peace. Whether you are 50, 70, or beyond, this message is for you because the wisdom of age is not about being unmoved, but about learning to return to stillness, even when the wind blows. So breathe. You're not defeated. You are not broken. You're being invited to look at anxiety differently. Let's begin. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Anxiety doesn't appear out of nowhere. It has roots, deep ones. And in Buddhist philosophy, those roots are known by two simple yet powerful words: attachment and aversion. Imagine the mind as a hand. Attachment is the grasp. It clings to what we love, to comfort, routine, youth, certainty. Aversion is the push. It recoils from pain, illness, change, and the uncomfortable unknown. And between these two movements, grasping and resisting, anxiety finds fertile ground to grow. Especially as we grow older, these habits become more visible. We hold on tightly to the people we've built our lives around, to the image of how things used to be. And we push away what we fear: loneliness, loss, the aches in our body, the truth that everything changes. Take a quiet moment and reflect. What are you holding on to so tightly? And what are you constantly trying to keep away? The Buddha taught that all things that arise will pass away. Our bodies, our relationships, even our emotions, they all shift, just like the seasons. But it's our resistance to this truth, our desire to freeze time, that brings suffering. Anxiety whispers, "You're losing control." But the deeper truth is, we never had control to begin with. Let me put this into gentle perspective. You're not wrong for loving deeply. You're not weak for wanting to avoid pain. These are human instincts. But when we confuse them with permanence, when we forget the truth of impermanence, we suffer more than we need to. Buddhist wisdom doesn't ask us to stop loving or to welcome pain. It asks us to soften our grip, to recognize that peace doesn't come from holding tighter. It comes from loosening with grace. So the next time anxiety rises, pause and ask yourself, am I clinging to something that's changing? Am I pushing away something that simply wants to be felt? This gentle inquiry can open a door to freedom. Because the moment we stop fighting reality and begin to meet life as it is, anxiety starts to loosen, and the heart begins to breathe again. Let me share with you a story. It's about Tom, an old friend, a retired Navy veteran, and a man who once walked the lake trail near his home every morning at 6 a.m. sharp. Rain or shine, that quiet discipline was part of who he was. It gave him purpose, direction, a rhythm to start his day. But one winter, after a fall on the ice, Tom injured his hip. The doctors told him he needed rest, no more morning walks. What seemed like a small change became, for Tom, a quiet unraveling. He stopped sleeping well. Mornings became heavy, hollow. The same stillness that once grounded him now made him anxious. His routine was gone, but more than that, he felt like he was gone too. I feel like I lost a part of myself, he said to me once over tea. I asked him gently, Tom, what are you really holding on to? He paused, looked out the window, then said almost in a whisper, the version of me that could still move freely. That moment said everything. You see, anxiety often rises not from the change itself, but from our refusal to let go of what used to be. We cling to identities that no longer fit, to versions of ourselves that time has asked us to release, and in that tight grip, suffering takes root. The Buddha taught, whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. Nothing stays the same. But that doesn't mean we lose ourselves. It means we are invited to meet who we are now, with kindness. Tom didn't need to walk the trail to have meaning. He only needed to find a new way to walk with life. There is a quiet line in the Dhammapada, the ancient words of the Buddha, that speaks straight to the heart of anxiety. It says, from attachment springs grief, from attachment springs fear. But he who is free from attachment knows neither grief nor fear. Simple, yet profound. So much of our suffering doesn't come from life itself, but from how tightly we try to hold it all together. We want people to stay. We want our bodies to feel the same. We want certainty, safety, familiarity. But life in its deepest truth is always shifting. Like the tide, it moves. And when we try to build permanence in the middle of the ocean, we begin to drown in fear and sorrow. Letting go isn't about giving up. It's not about detachment in the cold sense. It's about softening our grip on the past, on perfection, on the need to control what we never truly owned in the first place. Think of a leaf resting on the surface of a stream. It doesn't sink, it doesn't fight the current, it floats, it flows. That's what Buddhist wisdom invites us to do, to trust the river of life, even when we don't know where it leads. And here's the gentle miracle. The moment we stop resisting, even for a breath, we often feel a wave of peace rise in its place. Because the burden of clinging is heavier than the fear of falling. So today, take a breath and ask yourself, not with judgment, but with love, what am I holding on to that's ready to be released? Because letting go isn't loss. It's the beginning of freedom. There's a moment many of us know too well. It might come in the middle of the night, lying awake while the world sleeps, or during a quiet afternoon when you pause long enough to feel the weight pressing on your chest. A thought enters, what if something's wrong? Or what if this never gets better? And suddenly you're not in the present anymore. You're caught in the storm of the mind. But here's the gentle truth the Buddha offered, one that has calmed monks in remote temples and everyday people in kitchen chairs. This too is just a thought. Let those words settle for a moment, because not every thought that enters your mind is true. Not every fear deserves your trust. Some thoughts are echoes from the past, some are habits passed down over time, and some are just your brain trying to protect you, imagining the worst to keep you safe. But a thought is not a fact. It is not who you are. It's a cloud passing through the sky of your awareness. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to follow it. A wise monk once said, "Don't believe everything you think." That's not denial. It's liberation. Imagine this. Each time a fearful thought arises, you gently whisper to yourself, this too is just a thought. No panic, no battle. Just presence, just awareness. In Buddhist teaching, this is known as non-identification, the understanding that you are not your thoughts. You are the one who observes them. And when you can see your anxiety from that distance, not as truth, but as passing energy, something begins to shift. The storm doesn't disappear, but it loses its power to define you. So the next time your thoughts begin to spiral, pause, breathe, and remember, this too is just a thought, and you are the stillness that watches it pass. Let me introduce you to Marlene. She's 76, widowed, living alone for the first time in decades. Her days had grown quiet, quieter than she liked to admit, and it was in that silence that the thoughts began. What if I fall and no one's there to help me? What if I forget something important? What if my memory is slipping? Each question arrived like a whisper, but together they built a storm. Her chest would tighten, her heart would race, and before long, anxiety wrapped around her like a fog she couldn't shake. These weren't imaginary fears. They were grounded in possibility, but they weren't happening. They were thoughts, persistent, heavy, uninvited. Then one day, her daughter suggested she join a mindfulness class at the local senior center. Hesitant at first, Marlene decided to give it a try. During one session, the teacher asked everyone to write down a simple sentence. "This thought is not me. It is just a thought." Marlene stared at the page. It felt strange, almost silly, but something about it lingered. She went home and taped that sentence to her refrigerator, and slowly it became her anchor. Whenever the fears returned, and they did, she'd take a breath, place her hand on her heart, and whisper to herself, "This thought is not me. It is just a thought." Little by little, the fog began to lift. The thoughts still came, but they no longer took over. She began to smile more, to enjoy her tea again, to walk without dread. What changed wasn't her reality. It was how she related to it. In Buddhism, this is the heart of transformation. Not the disappearance of fear, but the quiet courage to see it clearly, without becoming it. Marlene didn't erase her anxiety. She learned how to stand beside it, with breath, with compassion, with clarity. And that is the beginning of peace. There's a quiet shift that happens when we stop saying, "I am anxious," and begin to say, "I am feeling anxiety." It's subtle, but powerful. Because in Buddhist teaching, this shift is everything. It's called non-identification, the wisdom of understanding that you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not even your fear. You are the one who notices them. You are the sky, not the storm. Thoughts come and go like passing clouds. Some arrive gently, others with thunder. But none of them define the vastness of who you are. When we fully believe our thoughts, especially the fearful ones, they begin to shape our identity. We start to live as though they are permanent truths. But they're not. They're movements of the mind, habits of worry, old echoes that sometimes feel louder than they are. The practice, then, is not to silence these thoughts, but to meet them with awareness. To say gently, "Ah, this is fear speaking, but this is not me." And the more we practice this, the more we begin to feel space opening around even the most intense emotions. We stop being swallowed by the wave and start becoming the ocean beneath it. Ajahn Chah, a beloved Buddhist teacher, once said, "If you let go a little, you'll have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you'll have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you'll be free." Non-identification is not detachment from life. It's liberation from false identity. You are not broken. You are not your anxious mind. You are the awareness behind it. And when you remember that, even for a moment, you return to your true home. It often begins with something small, a flicker of unease while sipping your morning tea, a tightness in the chest while folding laundry, a vague feeling that something is off, even though everything seems fine. This is how anxiety quietly slips in, not always as a storm, but as a subtle pull, drawing your mind away from this moment and into the shadows of what if and what once was. But in Buddhist practice, there is a doorway back to peace. That doorway is mindfulness, the art of simply being where you are, not fixing, not escaping, just returning. Mindfulness isn't about clearing the mind or feeling perfectly calm. It's about gently noticing what is, the breath in your nose, the sensation in your hands, the sound of birds outside the window. These are not distractions. They are anchors. The Buddha said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." Because anxiety lives in the future, but peace only ever lives now. Even 5 minutes of mindful breathing can shift your entire day. Not because your problems disappear, but because you remember you are more than your worries. You are the one who sees. So the next time anxiety visits, try this. Sit quietly, feel your feet on the floor, take a breath slow and steady, Let it rise and fall like a wave. This is your anchor. This is your home. And in this simple return to presence, you may discover something unexpected. The moment you are in is enough. Let me tell you about Frank. He's 81, a retired carpenter. Quiet, kind, a man of few words but deep presence. After his wife passed, Frank said the silence in the house began to change. It no longer felt peaceful. It echoed. Her absence filled every room. Small worries began to visit him more often. What if I forget something important? What if I fall and no one knows? What if I become a burden to my kids? He didn't talk about it much, but the weight showed in his eyes. At his doctor's suggestion, Frank joined a local mindfulness meditation group. He didn't expect much. In fact, on the first day, he nearly turned around before going in, but something told him to stay. The teacher began by asking them to close their eyes and follow the breath, not to force it, not to change it, just to notice it. Frank later shared, "At first, all I noticed was how loud my thoughts were, but then I began to feel the breath. Then I heard the birds. I noticed the warmth in my hands." That was his turning point. He started practicing 5 minutes a day, sitting quietly in his garden, hands on his knees, eyes soft, breath steady. He didn't try to silence his mind. He just watched it, like watching clouds drift across the sky. And over time, the clouds began to lighten. Frank's anxiety didn't vanish, but it softened. Because now, he had an anchor. The breath became his refuge, his reminder that life is happening now, not in yesterday's regrets, not in tomorrow's fears, but right here. In Buddhism, this is the heart of practice, not escaping the storm, but remembering. You are not the storm. You are the sky that holds it. And with every breath, Frank returned, not to the past, not to fear, but to himself. There's a voice that often comes with anxiety, and it's not the anxious thought itself. It's the voice that follows, the one that whispers, "You shouldn't feel this way. You're weak. You should have figured this out by now." It's the voice of self-judgment. And over time, it does more damage than the anxiety ever could. But Buddhist wisdom offers a gentle, radical alternative. Compassion. Not just for others, but for yourself. You see, many of us were raised to be strong, to put others first, to carry on without complaint. Especially in the later chapters of life, we've worn many roles: parent, partner, caregiver. And in the process, we often forgot to care for the one quietly carrying it all, ourselves. So when anxiety finally surfaces, it brings more than just fear. It brings guilt, shame, even confusion. Why now? What's wrong with me? But the Buddha taught, you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. This isn't indulgence, it's medicine. A soft hand on the heart, a kind word to the mind. When anxiety visits, try this. Speak to yourself as you would to a dear friend. Replace, "What's wrong with me?" with, "This is hard, and I'm doing the best I can." Place your hand gently over your chest. Breathe. Let yourself be seen by you. Compassion doesn't erase anxiety, but it softens it. It quiets the harshness, and it reminds you of something essential. You are not a burden. You are a human being, learning to heal. Let me tell you about Ruth. She's 79, a retired nurse, a mother, a caregiver, a woman who spent her life putting others first. If someone needed her, she showed up. No hesitation, strong, reliable, always the steady one. But after retirement, and especially after losing her sister, Ruth found herself unraveling in ways she didn't expect. Mornings felt heavier. Simple things like getting dressed or calling a friend suddenly felt daunting. "I don't understand," she said during one group meeting. "I've always kept it together. Why now?" That question wasn't about weakness. It was the voice of a woman who had never been taught to turn inward with care. At a mindfulness retreat hosted at her local community center, the teacher invited the group to place a hand over their heart and silently repeat, "May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I accept myself just as I am." Ruth couldn't do it at first. Her chest tightened. Tears welled. It felt strange, even selfish. But the teacher gently reminded her, self-compassion isn't about ego, it's about not turning away from your own pain. That simple act, hand to heart, words of kindness, became Ruth's practice. Not perfect, not always easy. But slowly the shame began to soften. The anxiety, once sharp and biting, became something she could sit beside. She even began writing letters to herself, loving notes to the tired parts, the grieving parts, the parts she never gave a voice. And through that simple kindness, Ruth began to feel whole again. This is the quiet power of compassion, not to fix, but to witness. Not to erase pain, but to say gently, "You're not alone. I'm here with you." There are moments, quiet, heavy moments, when anxiety feels like it has taken over everything. The racing heart, the restless thoughts, the sense that something is deeply wrong. And in those moments, it's easy to say, "I am anxious," as if this fear defines you, as if this storm is who you are. But over 2,500 years ago, the Buddha offered a simple, liberating truth, one that breaks the illusion of identification and opens the door to peace. This is not mine, this is not me, this is not who I am. These words are not denial, they are freedom. In Buddhist teachings, this insight is rooted in anatta, the principle of non-self. It reminds us that our thoughts, our feelings, even our pain, they arise, they pass, but they do not make up the core of who we are. You are not your anxiety. You are the one who sees it. You are the open sky, steady, vast, unbroken, no matter how loud the storm becomes. Let me offer a practice. When fear arises, don't resist it. Instead, pause. Place your hand over your heart. Breathe. And softly say, "This is not mine. This is not me. This is not who I am." Feel how those words create space between you and the suffering. Feel how they remind you, the anxious thought is a visitor, not the homeowner. It might knock on your door, but it doesn't own the keys. When you begin to repeat this thought with sincerity, anxiety may still arise, but it loses its grip. Because now you remember the truth. Who you are is deeper than fear, more spacious than any emotion, more peaceful than the mind can imagine. So the next time anxiety visits, meet it with these words. Not to fight it, but to remind yourself, "I am not this storm. I am the sky that holds it." Let me introduce you to Walter. He's 82, a widower, quiet and thoughtful. Since the passing of his wife, Walter had been living alone in the same house they shared for over 40 years. He didn't talk much about his grief, but it lingered like a shadow in the corners of every room. Over time, anxiety began to settle in. He described it as a gnawing in his chest, a heavy dread that came without warning. "It feels like I'm disappearing into it," he once said, "like the fear is swallowing who I am." One afternoon, Walter joined a local mindfulness group. During one of the sessions, the instructor led a meditation inspired by the Buddha's teaching of non-self. She invited them to sit quietly, notice their breath, and repeat a phrase. "This is not mine. This is not me. This is not who I am." Walter said it softly, hand over heart. At first it felt foreign, but something about those words began to loosen something inside him. He practiced that phrase every morning. When the fear returned, and it often did, Walter would sit, breathe, and whisper, "This is not mine. This is not me. This is not who I am." And gradually, a shift began. The anxiety still came, but it no longer defined him. It was no longer his identity. It became something he could observe, acknowledge, and then let go. Walter began spending more time in his garden again, smiling more, breathing deeper, not because his pain vanished, but because he remembered who he truly was beneath it. In Buddhist practice, this is the heart of freedom, not the absence of emotion, but the gentle realization that we are not the emotion itself. Walter didn't escape his anxiety. He disidentified from it, and in doing so, he found peace. Because sometimes the most powerful healing begins with one small truth whispered in the dark. This is not who I am. It's one thing to hear a teaching that touches your heart, but it's another to live it when the house is quiet, the mind is busy, and the worries feel real. This is where the true practice begins. The Buddha never asked us to run from our pain. He invited us to meet it with awareness, breath, and compassion. So let's take a moment now, wherever you are, to gently bring this teaching into your life. Begin by sitting comfortably. Or if you're standing, feel your feet firmly rooted on the ground. Let your body be just as it is. No need to adjust, no need to resist. Take a slow breath in, and as you breathe out, feel yourself settle. Now call to mind something that's been causing you anxiety. A fear, a regret, a worry that lingers like a shadow. You don't need to fix it. Just bring it gently into your awareness, like holding a stone in the palm of your hand. Now repeat silently or whisper if you feel safe to do so. This is not mine. Pause. Feel the space those words create. This is not me. Pause again. Notice the gentle distance between you and the emotion. This is not who I am. Breathe. Let that truth settle like sunlight through a window. You haven't erased the feeling. You've simply stepped out of its grip. You've remembered that this anxious thought is not your identity. It's just a passing wave. Throughout your day, return to this practice. You don't need a meditation cushion. You can use it while washing the dishes, while walking to the mailbox, while lying awake at 3 a.m. Whenever fear arises, repeat softly, "This is not mine, this is not me, this is not who I am," and come back to the present, to the breath, to the steadiness that has always lived inside you. Because in this simple return, you begin to remember your true self, the one that anxiety cannot touch. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Let me share with you a true story from a small mindfulness group in Oregon, a woman named Ellen. Ellen is 74, a retired librarian with soft eyes and a quiet voice. After losing her husband of nearly 50 years, the days felt endless. Though her body was healthy, her thoughts were restless. Every small sensation sparked panic. What if this pain is serious? What if no one finds me in time? Her mind spiraled daily, pulling her from one fearful thought to another. She tried journaling, she tried puzzles, even long walks, but the thoughts always followed. One morning during a community meditation group, the instructor introduced the phrase, "This is not mine, this is not me, this is not who I am." Ellen didn't feel anything at first, but something about the quiet strength in those words stayed with her. Later that evening, while sitting in her recliner, a wave of anxiety began to rise. Her heart pounded, her breath shortened. She nearly reached for the phone, but instead, she closed her eyes and began to whisper, "This is not mine. This is not me. This is not who I am." Again and again with each breath, like a lullaby for the nervous system. And something softened. Not all at once, but enough. From that night forward, it became her ritual. Anytime the fear returned, she didn't resist it. She met it. She greeted it like a visitor, and she reminded both of them, "This isn't who I am." Today, Ellen still practices, still whispers, still breathes. She hasn't erased her fears, but they no longer erase her. And that, as the Buddha might say, is the beginning of freedom, not escaping life, but remembering who you truly are when life becomes loud. In our modern world where everything moves fast and change feels relentless, it's easy to forget that peace doesn't come from controlling life. It comes from how we relate to it. For many in their 50s, 60s, or 70s, the noise may no longer be from the outside but from within. The echoes of loss, the silence of an empty home, the uncertainty of aging. And yet, as Ellen's story reminds us, we are never powerless. The simple act of recognizing a thought for what it is, a passing visitor, not a permanent truth, can shift everything. We don't need to win the war against anxiety. We only need to stop identifying with it. In a culture that teaches us to suppress our feelings or define ourselves by our productivity, the most radical thing we can do is pause, breathe, and say, "This is not mine. This is not me. This is not who I am." That phrase isn't just a spiritual tool. It's a daily life preserver. And the more we practice, the more we remember, we are not our fear, our age, or our past. We are awareness itself, quiet, vast, and still very much alive. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. If you've stayed with me this far, take a moment, just one slow breath, and let it land softly within you. Because what we've explored together isn't just a collection of ideas. It's a practice, a way of living, a quiet shift in how we meet life's most persistent companion, anxiety. The goal was never to erase it. The Buddha never promised a life without storms. What he offered instead was the wisdom to stay steady within them. And this practice, the breath, the awareness, the mantra, this is not mine, not me, not who I am. It's not meant to push anything away. It's meant to keep you rooted when the winds rise. You don't need a retreat center. You don't need perfect stillness. You just need presence, a willingness to meet yourself gently, right where you are. There will still be moments when the chest tightens, when the past visits or the future feels too big. But now, you have a new way of responding, not with fear, but with understanding. Not with shame, but with compassion. Anxiety may still knock at your door, but you no longer have to invite it in as truth. You can simply greet it, breathe, and remember, you are not your worry. You are the awareness holding it. This is not escape. This is freedom lived. One breath, one thought, one gentle letting go at a time.